What a delight to see nearly 161, 162 people. The number's growing all the time. What a powerful community of people we are. Chris and I are talking with you today about digital inclusion, current challenges and future implications. We're going to be presenting across the next 30 minutes or so. We'll be flipping between presenters. Chris, though, is driving because, in no small irony, my internet connection is a little bit unstable this afternoon. So I'll be asking Chris to change the slides. Chris, can I ask you to change the slide? Thanks. So just for those of you who don't know a great deal about the Centre for Social Impact, otherwise known as CSI, we're a partnership between the University of New South Wales, University of Western Australia and Swinburne University of Technology. We exist to create a better world, no small appetite for that. We do that through a range of different activities, including our graduate and undergraduate education, which is the most comprehensive education programs in social impact in the country, our applied research and our scholarly research, and our strong commitment to catalysing change through an integration between all of those activities. So just a bit of background for you on CSI. Chris, next slide, thanks. I do want to also add to Nicola's acknowledgements, my acknowledgements of the traditional custodians of the land on which we variously meet. Wherever you are in Australia, just acknowledging that you are on Aboriginal land, and I particularly want to acknowledge from where I sit the Eora Nation and elders past, present and emerging. In terms of what we're going to talk about today, we're going to take you through various research projects that we've been involved in and drawing on the data from those projects, as well as wider evidence from other sources. But given that we are speaking on a number of projects in which we partner, we wanted to acknowledge those partners before we get going today. So we'll be talking in quite some detail about the Australian Digital Inclusion Index, and we particularly wanted to acknowledge Professor Julian Thomas from RMIT, who's the leader of that project, and also his full team, the Digital Inclusion Unit at Telstra, and I suspect one or two of them are on the call, so feel free to weigh in if we get anything wrong. Obviously Swinburne Centre for Social Impact, and also Roy Morgan Research, who are partners, who are the data partners to the Digital Inclusion Index. We're going to talk a little bit about organisational digital inclusion, and in regard to that project, we'll be drawing on some work from Giving Australia 2016, which is the largest national study of giving and volunteering ever conducted in this country. And we're partners to that project and want to acknowledge our colleagues from QUT, particularly Associate Professor Wendy Scaife, and our colleagues from the Centre for Corporate Public Affairs, and the sponsors for that project, Prime Minister's Community Business Partnership and Commonwealth Department of Social Services. And finally, just a quick thanks to Nicola and Rhonda from the communications team at CSI, who've put impact2020 together so beautifully. Next slide, thanks, Chris. So what are we going to cover today? Well, we're looking at some key issues in relation to digital inclusion, and we're not going to keep the big reveal till later. On the next slide, I'll share with you some of our key takeouts from the material that we've put together and synthesised for this presentation. But where are we right now? I mean, I think we're all in the middle of what's going on with COVID-19 containment and our public health and economic responses to that. So there's probably not much that I can tell you that you're not already experiencing. But clearly one of the things we've seen, it's very prevalent in the university sector, has been absolute demand for rapid digital transformation of systems and practices. And, you know, that's been very prevalent in the education sector, but also in the delivery of public services. As we are less able to meet face-to-face, we're seeing significant quick uptake of cultural product online, and also opportunities for social connectivity, whether that's between family members who are in different houses through to wider communities and the groups in which we're involved. So there's no question that this has been forced upon us, and some of you will have seen floating around on social media that little animation image on the side there through Forbes about what's led to the digital transformation of your company. And there's no question that COVID-19 has brought to bear transformations that would typically take 2 years and lots of talking, often done within 3 days. It's quite phenomenal. As part of that, we've seen this huge upswing in digital creativity and innovation. And as a specialist in social innovation, I'm blown away by some of the social innovations I'm seeing appear through digital means just over the last 4 weeks. But of course, the dark underbelly of this is the digital exclusion that some people experience and the exacerbation of that digital inequality emerging for both individual people and for organisations. And that's really what we're planning to focus on today. Next slide, thanks, Chris. So what are the key takeouts that we wanted to bring to you and, of course, get your feedback on? We think that addressing personal and organisational digital equality has never been more important. Obviously, we're in a moment right now where our reliance on digital communication is more profound than ever. And as we come out of the lockdown requirements, that is not going to go away. And that means that the unequal access and participation in online activity becomes more exacerbated as a result. We think that it's important to identify the characteristics of digital disadvantage experienced by particular groups of people and also in particular geographies, because that helps us to get clear on where we need to commit resources and what are the best kinds of resources that need to be committed. So really understanding both the details and the demography of digital inclusion and exclusion is really important. We are also observing and want to acknowledge some significant efforts from governments, industry, not-for-profits and social enterprises to address the immediate impact of COVID-19 on digital inequality, and Chris will speak to some of those immediate actions that we're observing. And then finally, I think, you know, as we're seeing in a number of different social domains, social issues with regard to what's going on with COVID-19, it does give us both a concrete reason and a social moment in which to reflect on where we want to go. And we think that it's really going to be important that what has been a rather piecemeal approach to resolving the issues of digital inequality historically comes to the fore and is attended to in a systematic, coordinated and appropriately targeted way. Now I'm going to hand over to Chris, who's going to take you through some of the real detail because he's the brains of the operation.
Thanks, Jo. Great, thank you for it was an excellent introduction, and I do ask you to focus on those particular takeout messages as we're going through. So I just wanted to start by acknowledging that our key concern with digital inequality is the way in which differences in personal engagement with the internet actually translate into different benefits in terms of social, economic, cultural, and personal benefits from the outcomes of that engagement. So from that perspective, it is non-users, those people who are not using the internet at all, who really derive no direct benefits from the internet, and so could be considered the most digitally disadvantaged. So the latest data from the ABS tells us there's about 2.5 million Australians who are not online. That is, they've not been online in the last 3 months, which I think is a fairly absolute measure that clearly they're not engaging with the internet. So 2.5 million Australians, they make up part of the 1.25 million households who are not connected. Now, over the last few years, we've seen some improvement in those numbers. So we've seen a decrease in the people who are not connected. But if you can look at the graph on the slide here, you'll see that the numbers, we're not making much improvement over the last, over the last 2 or 3 years. So effectively, we've got this kind of last group of people, very hard to shift into the online space. And making very limited progress in that area. Why? Well, a number of reasons. Some ABS data collected a few years ago, did some work on why people are not online, why they're not connecting. Lack of need was one of the key issues. 2 in 3 suggests that it's a lack of need as to why they are not online. And then on top of that, we have a lack of confidence or knowledge, and also, of course, cost, which is a major impediment to engagement. Now, we may see under COVID-19 a shift in that lack of need. I think people now are absolutely coming to terms with the idea that the internet is something that will provide great benefit, and they probably want to be online. But the lack of confidence and knowledge, the cost and other barriers, even device access at the moment is difficult. Those are going to be really challenging to try to work out how we're going to solve some of those problems in a kind of situation of lockdown. So a difficult problem for the most digitally disadvantaged group. But of course, digital inequality extends beyond those who are not connected. I mean, the benefits from the internet don't accrue equally to all who are on the internet. So really, the opportunity to benefit from the internet is not just about being online. It's about having an effective and really good quality internet access. It's about the affordability of that access. And then it's about the skills that you have when you get online in order to make it the most of being on there. It's the way in which you convert those things into the real benefits and the offline benefits as well as online benefits. So those three aspects, access, affordability, and abilities, make up a key component of the Australian Digital Inclusion Index. The index basically has about 100 indicators that we draw data from individuals, and then we can measure where they sit in terms of those three different dimensions. We then add those together and we come up with a score out of 100 to work out how digitally included people are. Now, over the last few years, we've seen some improvement in digital inclusion on aggregate across the population, but the really important thing about the index is to think about who's missing out. So we have this great little chart in the Digital Inclusion Index report, which is an annual edition. And you'll see this chart in that report, which really takes through the contours of the demographic and socioeconomic elements of digital inclusion and digital inequalities. We also have an overlay of geographic digital inequality. I won't talk a lot about that today, except to say and to acknowledge that people living in the regions and in remote areas have a much lower digital inclusion than those living in highly densely populated urban areas. From the contours of digital inequality we see here, we can see that low-income households, those who are not in the labour force, people who have lower levels of educational attainment, those sort of socioeconomic variables together show that those people are kind of on the wrong side of the digital divide. And age is also a major factor, with the over 65s, a really rapid decline from the 50 to 64 group down into that 65 plus group. So in addition to that, we have our disability measure here, which is recipients of disability payments. They also have a very low digital inclusion score, and Indigenous Australians measured here as regional and urban Indigenous Australians have low digital inclusion. And we also know from some of the work we've done in remote areas that that actually declines when you're looking and adding that layer of remoteness. So today we want to look at two things. We want to look at two groups that we think are going to be particularly impacted by the COVID-19 digital transformation. So the first, and we've basically got two propositions. One is, under COVID-19 physical isolation, older Australians are more likely to suffer social isolation. I'm going to talk about that in a second. The other one is that those, because of the push towards home-based schooling, children in low-income family households are likely to experience heightened educational disadvantage under these conditions. And I'm going to have a look at those in detail now. So the first is older Australians. We've got some data here from the Australian Digital Inclusion Index, from which you can clearly see there's quite a large gap between the 65 plus group and the overall Australian average of 61.9 as an index score. And we see that the issues really cross across access, affordability, and digital ability, but it's really the two components of access and digital ability that are really key here. We see a much lower rates of actual connectivity, and then when people are online in that older age group, much less effective forms of access. So, you know, less data, less high-speed connection, less fixed broadband in that age group. In terms of digital abilities, I think it's well acknowledged within the sector that there are concerns here. There is quite a lot of investment in training and education in that space. And clearly, we still have a long way to go. So that is another key factor here. Now, the issue is that older Australians, of course, under the COVID-19 response, they do have, or they are more vulnerable. And so what we've seen from government is really a kind of suggestion that they really be very, very diligent in the practice of physical isolation. And also, I think we're probably likely to see other age cohorts coming out of this period of physical isolation faster than those people in older age groups. So they'll be there longer. They'll probably be practicing this a bit more diligently than the rest of us. If you're digitally excluded on top of that, you don't get to use those digital tools that the rest of us are using to maintain or to reduce some of the hardships of isolation and maintain those connections. Now, things like shopping and various functional activities might be done offline with some assistance from friends or family. But some of the key things, that real kind of social contact, both informal and formal, those things, that sort of cultural and social contact is going to be hard to maintain in these conditions. I think we've all experiencing the Zoom drinks and the Zoom family get-togethers, and those are really difficult if you're not online, and obviously, even if you are online, if you don't have the skill set to make those things work. So we have real concerns about that. And we have concerns because there is clear links between social isolation and physical and mental health. We've seen some research from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare on that basis. We've seen we know that in the general population. We also know it is also the case for older Australians. So people like COTA, the Council for Older Australians, have done some advocacy in this area. And we know that one way to overcome that is through becoming more digitally engaged. So we do have some evidence there from the National Mental Health Commission, who's done a return on investment study about upskilling older Australians in that area. Does that have health impacts and benefits through reduced social isolation? Yes is their answer. So some key things and some key issues there around older Australians. I'm going to move on now to low-income family households. Again, if we look at the index scores for those groups, we see much lower overall scores for those in low-income family households with school-aged children compared to the aggregate of all families with school-aged children. So access may look like a small difference here in access, but of course we know in conditions where the schools have now, in most Australian governments have closed the schools, we expect that will be maintained for some time. Although there's talk of going back to some face-to-face education in the next month or two, I think it would be fair to say there's uncertainty around whether we may end up back in a situation of online learning as an exclusive delivery model in the future under this sort of COVID-19 developments. So if we don't see a vaccine, if we don't see developments in that area, we're probably likely to perhaps go back through processes of isolation again, in which online learning will come to the fore. So if you don't have access and you've got and you have school-aged children, obviously this is a complete impediment to you being able to engage in that space. Affordability, as we can understand, these are low-income households. Affordability is a key issue for this group. But I also wanted to mention the digital abilities area. So, I mean, basically what this is telling us is that low-income households, parents do not have the same level of digital skills to help their children in that online learning space as other more higher socioeconomic households. So there are certainly some differentiation there. Skills is an interesting case, actually. Julian Fralin from ASA, the Australian Council for Education Research, published a piece a couple of weeks back in which he challenged the assumptions that a lot of us have, that young people will just be okay because they're digital natives. They've grown up with the internet, so they'll naturally have a set of skills that will allow them to thrive in the online environment. He's drawn on both a large Australian study, the NAP ICT study, and a large international study to show that actually that's just not the case. Young people generally in the primary and secondary school kids have a good level of kind of basic skills. And then once you get above that into the advanced skill range, that's when things drop away. Those advanced skills, he talks about those advanced skills as being really important to work independently and to work critically. So I think, the kind of concept that the kids will just be okay is probably not one we want to really rely upon. What we also know from the work of both the NAP ICT study and also the OECD PISA study is that when you look at attainment in those digital skills areas, you see that students from lower socioeconomic households have lower levels of attainment. So there's actually a divide within the skill set itself within those groups. Now, we also know, of course, that students from lower socioeconomic households in general suffer from educational disadvantage. So we're really seeing here, if we get a digital disadvantage layer over the top of that, we're going to see an exacerbation of those educational outcomes. There's another nice little piece from Sue Thompson from ASA as well, which looks at the PISA studies from 2018 into what the home learning environment looks like. And it finds some discrepancies in what a kind of safe and quiet home learning, or a quiet home learning environment for students in lower socioeconomic households to higher socioeconomic households. And again, differentiation in the amount of computer access at home. It may be small. I think it's 99% of students from high socioeconomic groups have a computer at home to use for schoolwork, about 84% for those from low socioeconomic groups. But now we've moved to an exclusive online delivery model. That percentage makes a huge impact. So it may look small, but has a big impact. So clearly some issues there. One of the things I think of great concern is that some of the educational research shows us that students in lower socioeconomic households, when they fall behind at any point in the educational kind of cycle, they find it much more difficult to catch up than do students from higher socioeconomic groups. So I've put on the slide here a reference to the Educational Opportunity in Australia study done out of the Mitchell Institute. And I think this is the real concern. This may not go on for very long. We may have online learning as an exclusive delivery model for maybe half a term. It may go for a full term, and it may come back in the future. And that may seem like a minor disruption that all students are feeling equally. But what we do know is that students from lower socioeconomic households are probably likely to feel it a little more. And in feeling it a little more, they're less likely to be able to catch up in later stages. So I think it is a real area we need to have some focus on. And I know people are doing things in this space to try to deal with that immediate need. And I'll talk a little bit about those later, but I think it is really one to keep in mind from the work that we've done. I'm going to hand back to Jo now. She's going to chat a little bit about some of the organisational challenges.
Thanks, Chris. And just acknowledging a lot of you are asking some really great questions and also helping each other through the chat function, which is terrific because, of course, you know, with 200 odd people on the webinar, there's quite a lot of expertise among us. And apologies to those who've asked some very questions that are very specific to something that Chris was saying in a given moment. We might not be able to catch all of those, but we'll do our best in the discussion Q&A session. So we did want to speak briefly about digital inequality at the level of organisations as distinct from at the level of people, because this is obviously also has fairly considerable implications for the way in which our public health system works, for the way in which we access services, and the way in which those services are manifest out to those who are most in need in the community. And also has significant implications for how we build back better in terms of what our economic dynamism might look like as we move out of containment and into recovery. It's a bit challenging to talk about this topic though, because we really don't have very good quality data across both businesses and also not-for-profit organisations, which is my key area of interest and expertise. And that is actually concerning. And I would note that while Chris has been able to pull together some marvellous resources there, that not just the resources that we produce with our colleagues through the Australian Digital Inclusion Index, there's no question that that index's existence provides a very rich and updatable data set that we don't see in the organisational space, and that is a concern. And we need to look at that sort of paucity of data, because it is actually a missing link in terms of what we know and therefore what we can predict and model. But having given you that little background, I guess the main things that we did want to observe was that government research to date indicates relatively low digital uptake by small to medium businesses, so SMEs. Now, of course, there are many contexts in which low digital uptake may be perfectly appropriate to the type of business type of products that are being delivered and the type of market that's being met. But across the board, we would say that, you know, over the last 15 years, there are strong economic imperatives for us to be economically active in in a digital context, and in Australia the uptake for small to medium enterprises is not as strong as is desirable. The research from the Giving Australia project, which I mentioned during my introductory comments, finds also, not surprisingly, and there are other data sources on this as well, that the use and access to digital technologies by not-for-profit organisations, generally speaking, is relatively low compared to other sectors. Just wanted to point that out. So one of the key figures that we found in Giving Australia was that about 78% of charities, and that of course is not the whole of the not-for-profit sector, but about 78% of charitable organisations identified digital capability as being really important to the future of volunteering, fundraising, service delivery and civil society, but only 20% of those organisations felt that they were currently using these technologies well. And there's a whole lot of reasons for that. Part of it is to do with simply the resource constraints within those organisations, and recognising there are about 600,000 not-for-profits in Australia, and the large majority of those are small, volunteer-run and very focused on local needs. But there are access problems to the hardware. There are access problems to the infrastructure, and then also the digital abilities is a key issue. And there has been some interesting developments in the last few weeks around this, and I'll speak to that in relation to a slide a bit further along in the presentation. Oh, actually, no, I won't. It's on this slide. Apologies. So one thing we note, particularly for those not-for-profits that are particularly in the business of emergency relief, those services are currently being constrained by the digital capacity of some of those providers. And I can't speak in pure scientific terms because this is data that's being collected as we speak, but some of the stories that I'm hearing relate a little bit similar to some of the issues for kids in lower income households. Often frontline staff whose delivery mode is usually face to face with people, their organisations don't have sufficient digital devices to allow them to do this work from home in the way that they're being asked to. And then the other side of it, of course, is the digital inequality and exclusion experienced by the communities that these organisations seek to serve. When you've got both ends of that particular relationship not sufficiently equipped with both the technology and the abilities to use digital technologies, then you've obviously got trouble. And I'll hand back to Chris.
Great, thank you very much. I was just having a look at some of the chat as we went through there, and I did notice somebody asking about the Digital Inclusion Index report, and I will post a link to that at some point. But if you do a Google search on Australian Digital Inclusion Index, it will take you to the website. You can download the current report. You can also download some data sets from there from 2014 right through into 2019. So, and in the next few months, we'll be working on the 2020 report, and we should have that out sometime later in the year.
Chris, just letting you know, you're getting a crowdsourced response. Several people have put the ADII link up in the chat section.
Excellent, thank you. So lots of challenges, and one of the amazing things has been in working in this space, and I think certainly at the Australian Digital Inclusion Alliance webinar the other day, I think a lot of people are realizing a lot of years of hard work in trying to push the topic of digital inclusion and digital inequality and addressing that, and we're seeing some fairly rapid responses in from a range of players and range of stakeholders. So I wanted to, there is a lot, and obviously I can't cover all of them. What I'd like to do is point you to two places. One is the Australian Communications Consumer Action Network. You'll see there a list of the initiatives being run by the telcos themselves, and Info Exchange, which has a bunch of material around what enterprise can do and various other things. So those two groups have quite a nice comprehensive list of things. I thought I'd point to a few different things that are happening. You will have most of you may have experienced the additional free data being offered by the telcos, both at a personal level, but also for small to medium enterprises. Telcos are also doing work in the sort of financial hardship area. I mean, they really are working hard, I think, to try to keep people online in what is a very difficult period. So, I mean, I think we often telcos and big corporations are not considered in a kind of positive light in these sort of spaces, but I think they are doing a good job of doing things to help and fairly quickly to do that. So there's some support for those on Job Seeker. So there's some cheaper access options there. Unmetered sites, particularly government sites and information sites that are required. We've seen a bit of that. I wanted to briefly mention a project that Telstra is doing in Shepparton, mainly because it's a kind of research-oriented project as well as a delivery project. It actually predated the COVID-19 crisis, and that is the provision of 100 laptops and internet access to low-income families with school-aged children. And that project will go on for a couple of years, and it will be really interesting to see, kind of, because there's a sort of an evaluation going with that, the sort of outcomes of that project, and then how that might inform some longer-term strategies that we really want to see in action. NBN has come to the party with a $150 million relief package. So $50 million for connecting low-income families, $50 million for small to medium enterprises, and some residential hardship money as well. And also some increased capacity on the satellite, which is obviously in these conditions of the move to exclusive online education provision, very, very important in remote and rural communities. We've seen some work from big tech, Google, Microsoft, etc., offering free trials and expanded service availability. And governments have been involved in a range of different things, including school packages, trying again to try to address that issue of those households that may not have devices or connections. I did notice last night, and I watch a lot of commercial television, but I did notice an ad looking at supporting older Australians and the social isolation impacts there. And there was a call in that ad for community support for sort of a digital uptake from that population. Now, that's challenging, and I'm not sure that's exactly the only response we want from government, but certainly there is an identification that there is a concern and that there should be people assisting in this area. Not-for-profits, of course, very heavily involved in this space of digital inclusion, particularly in the training and support area. We've seen it's really challenging to try to deliver digital training in a digital space. And I know there's a lot of work being done from stakeholders to try to get a model in which that might work. So we've seen that both in the personal area and also assistance for small to medium enterprises and the digitisation of them as well. Most recently, we've seen $1 million through the Be Connected program for the funding of devices and internet access for older Australians. So again, we're seeing some moves in that area to kind of address some of these issues. Now, forgive me, I don't have all of them, and there's no doubt I've missed many of the things that a lot of you are doing. I know libraries and all sorts of institutions are involved in this space, but this is just a bit of a taste that there are some things happening. One of our concerns about these things would be a lot of them are time-stamped, so they're short-term fixes. Now, it is a crisis. There is immediate need, but we would really like to see some of those things transferred into a more sort of coherent package for kind of addressing this, really intractable issue of digital inclusion that we've seen in existence for some time. Joe, did you want to finish up, or?
Yeah, but just before I do that, can you tell whoever it was who asked what SAC stands for?
Oh, sorry, yes, right, school-aged children.
Thank you.
Yeah, family of school-aged children. Thanks.
Dreaded acronyms in multidisciplinary groups of people. Just wanted, to reinforce, there's a whole lot of people putting up fabulous input into the chat function about resources that they're delivering and things that they're doing, etc. And a definite shout out to the Good Things Foundation in particular. But as Chris acknowledged, there's multiple activities going on. And I did want to also acknowledge the person who put up the material that, Be Connected and Info Exchange have just apart and now together been collecting over many years about the digital inclusion of the not-for-profit sector. I didn't mean to dismiss that, so thanks for sharing that data. A couple of things, I guess. I'm not sure that any of this will be too surprising for any of you, and you may have your own thoughts about what we think is going to happen beyond COVID containment. But I guess the things that we think are happening are a huge collective upswing in digital abilities for individuals and organisations at the macro level. So there's no question, if I am self-referential again, the digital literacies of higher education staff have gone through the roof in the last month. So there's no question that we're seeing a huge collective upswing at that macro level. But of course, one of the challenges with anything to do with inequality is that when you see everyone getting ahead, that means that the relativities in inequality become greater. So for those people who are experiencing the kinds of context that Chris has described in relation to older Australians and lower income households with school-aged children at home, the residual effects of that lagging behind will become more profound as those people who are already digitally connected are able to experience that collective upswing. So we think that that is a significant reality that we're facing. Obviously, nationally and globally, we're facing a significant downturn in market economics, and that is potentially going to force more people offline, particularly through unemployment patterns that take people out of offices and out of places where they may access the internet apart from at home. And also potentially greatly increase the household financial pressure of maintaining internet access where people's household incomes are going down as a result of the economic disruptions that we're experiencing. That's not going to be something that happens for 5 minutes, and I won't get on my soapbox about that because I'm talking to a lot of smart, connected people who understand these things. But we're talking about, a decade's worth of challenge, I would say. And further to my point before, I guess the main takeout is that digital transformation will amplify the social impact of that disadvantage. And that creates some significant issues because, as we talked about at the beginning, we've had a fairly uncoordinated and, piecemeal level of commitment in terms of governments in particular's commitment to ameliorating the effects of digital inequality in the Australian context. And while I'm deeply proud of being part of the Australian Digital Inclusion Index team, there's a little bit of me that worries that that is being delivered privately by academics working with Telstra and other providers. And, it is the routine data that we can speak about, and acknowledging there are other data sets that people on this webinar are involved in creating. But I think we've got to ask ourselves some pretty tough questions about where our data sources sit and the extent to which they are actually helping to support public value creation. And more importantly than the data, I mean, for me, data is important because it drives practice and policy. And so that's the big takeout, is if we see the deepening of the digital divide as a result of some of the issues we've discussed today, combined with this patchy and piecemeal approach to understanding what's going on. That's a double whammy, and we're going to be in some trouble. So I'm not meaning to end on a negative note. As I said at the beginning, those of you who know me know that social innovation is one of my key areas of interest and inquiry, and I'm profoundly excited by some of the amazing things that are happening at the absolutely micro level through to the meso level. In every, don't waste a good crisis. In any crisis, there's huge opportunity for innovation to occur. So I am heartened as well. I think Chris and I are also equally concerned. And that's what we wanted to share with you. And now we're going to move to Q&A and your questions and comments about the things that we've talked about. There's clearly a huge amount of material in the chat function already.
I've sent you both a list of all the questions that I've collected as we've gone through. Let me know if you didn't receive that. I'm happy to read them out.
Thanks, Nick. Actually, having suggested earlier, we won't get you to read them out. Given the volume of material and questions, we might get you to be the selector so that Chris and I don't get in trouble with our audience for avoiding their questions.
So the first one up was from Junie Baptiste Poitevien. I hope I pronounced that correctly. She says, in Katherine, Northern Territory, we, amongst other remote areas in the north, have had our Indigenous populations moving back to communities swiftly. However, we've lost contact with these people whom we connected with through our essential service. This is an opportunity to engage with telecoms to think through frugal innovation on increasing very remote communities' digital inclusion and access to continue to connect with these essential services in town. What would you recommend?
So I would recommend reading that message out in a webinar with a couple of hundred people in which a couple of telcos are represented, and encourage those telco staff to take that that comment on advisement and think about it. I do think that the frugal innovation, or what's called bricolage in entrepreneurship theory, is, you know, that's where we're seeing a lot of the sort of social innovations occurring at the moment. There are, of course, some larger scale things, but a lot of kind of, granular responses to connecting up the dots where, you know, there's gaps. I don't know the answer, particularly in relation to your context. Chris may have some thoughts. I do think that more broadly, I've been thinking about returning to old technologies. What can we do by picking up the telephone, using the television and the radio in ways that we haven't been? But in terms of the specific situation you're describing, I don't have an easy answer, and to give you one would just be glib. Chris, have you got anything you want to add?
I also don't have any of the answers. It is a really, really difficult problem because, of course, you know, it's a basic connectivity issue, and that's a real challenge to kind of to address in the sort of technological realm. And obviously, the introduction of NBN satellite services has improved things, but it is a really challenging space to work in. But I can point you to a few things that might be worth exploring, and one is the work of our colleagues out of RMIT, Ali Rennie in particular, and Julian Thomas. I'm probably forgetting names there, but they're the two that I know have written extensively on the subject of accessing remote communities. They have a fantastic little book out called Internet on the Outstation that I can point you to. The other thing would be Centre for Appropriate Technologies out of Alice Springs has, you know, very much looking at those kind of community kind of relevant interventions, you know, in terms of technological access. So they've done things like, you know, solar powered access points and so forth. So there are some things happening in that space. It's really challenging again because of the access issue. Obviously, the other thing is there's been quite a lot of work in the sort of Wi-Fi connectivity in communities, and so I know that the work of I know there's been a number of government activities in that area. One company who's done a lot of the supply work there is Easy Web Digital. So if you're interested in looking at some of the case study work they've done around using satellite connections and then distributing through last mile through Wi-Fi into community, that would be worth a look.
Next question. Rhiannon W asks, does the data explore digital exclusion where people experience multiple layers of disadvantage? For example, students in low-income households who also have a disability or developmental delay.
So yes and no, and Chris can explain the details. It's to do with the data set and how we are able to analyse it. So we're certainly aware, of course, of the multiple layers of disadvantage and indeed advantage that affect digital inclusion. And there are some things that we can verifiably conclude from the Digital Inclusion Index, but there's some things we can't. Chris, I'll get you to give the 30-second Boffin's version of the answer.
Sure. I mean, so the index itself, it's challenging to collect a sample that would have an appropriate number of people who are experiencing multiple levels of disadvantage across a national survey. So there's issues around the sample size there. That work is probably best explored in a more qualitative approach than our kind of sample survey approach. I know that there are a lot of people working in that space in terms of looking at creating looking at identifying issues and creating technical and social responses to that. But certainly it's not something that's in the ADII data set, but certainly something that more qualitative studies would no doubt investigate.
Okay. Next question. I'm just keeping my eye on the time as well. Jeremy from The Big Issue says he's keen to hear if there's any evidence of keystone skills or key transferable skills which assist people with less digital ability increase their digital ability. We have around 33% of Big Issue vendors with tap and go technology, and it's involved setting people up with an email address, operating, maintaining, remembering how to use the app. It's required plenty of problem solving from staff. So keen to hear if there are skills that we could assist vendors with to enable them with more general digital ability.
So I'll let Chris answer if he knows of any particular studies in this area. But one thing I would say function, and Chris mentioned the Be Connected program for digital inclusion for older Australians. I'm part of the evaluation team for that program, and unfortunately the data are not publicly available yet, but we will have something to say about this particular question in relation to older Australians in about 3 weeks' time, if presuming the draft reports are accepted. So, Chris, have you got any particular insights, or is there any particular research out there that would be helpful?
Possibly not. I can't think of any research off the top of my head. I mean, of course, there are a lot of digital skills frameworks that look at trying to identify basic and more advanced skills and to work out what some of the key things might be. But in fact, I'm sure in the chat function right now, there are many people who are providing frontline digital skills training who would have a better understanding of the kind of key skills that they see being translated into really effective internet access quickly. And I think that's what you're talking about here, ways in which you can get some sort of touchstone skills that then launch you into the internet quickly. And even though you may not be getting everything you can out of it, you're at least online and you're doing things. It sounds like the sort of touch and go technology you're talking about is one way to in some way address that, because it does mean that you can get things done quickly. But of course, I'm sure as you're finding, there are challenges with then keeping people aware of how that technology works, keeping them up to date with the kind of the ways in which they might use that technology. And of course, there are other issues around sort of agency and self-determination around the use of those technologies. So it's a challenging area, but I'm sure, again, in the chat function, you may be getting some joy from others who are providing those frontline skills.
And following on from that, Alan asked, what is the definition of advanced skills, and particularly in the context of primary and secondary students?
So I'm not speaking as a primary or secondary educator here. I'm sure there's actually like a curriculum answer to that question. But when we're talking about advanced skills, I guess we're talking about capacity for production, not just consumption online. So being able to, creatively use digital technologies to produce new knowledge resources, new cultural products, etc. And also the kinds of skills associated with online discernment. So, having stronger cybersecurity, and also being able to, recognise what's fake news, and what's not, those sorts of things.
Yeah, so that's and if you want to look at those studies, I think that there's a PISA study, there's the ICT NAP study, and there's the international. I can't remember anyway, it's on the slide set that you will have seen. Those studies, they look at exactly that, the kind of those differentiations between advanced and basic skills. And primarily it is around that idea of higher levels of creative functionality and digital literacies around identifying material, being able to verify sources, being able to protect yourself online. So those things are kind of much more advanced uses than merely receiving information using the internet and having basic inputs into forms or things like that.
Next question, I'm going to ask one that's been asked a couple of times in the chat. This one came from Sophia Patel, I think, first of all. What role do you think local governments should be playing in addressing digital inequality during the COVID-19 crisis, but also in recovery?
So local government, alongside not-for-profit organisations, really provides the civic infrastructure for inclusion in many forms. And we know, for example, that public libraries are a key place that are used by people who are not online at home to connect. So I think, you know, I've seen in social media a few calls to open up public libraries as soon as possible. I'm not going to propose things that might be contradictory to public health advice in this conversation, but certainly looking at how we can get that civic infrastructure up and running quickly is, I think, pretty important. And then the other thing is the sort of service networks that local government either delivers or coordinates, and the points of sort of social connection that are allowed through those service networks that actually allow people who are excluded, whether it's digitally or otherwise, to have contact with others so that we can get, so that the local areas can get the intelligence about what gaps there are. I think there are some key things that local government can do.
Yeah, I mean, I think a previous project I was involved in was the provision of public Wi-Fi by local governments, mainly also state governments in Australia. And it's been interesting to see the developments in that space, of course, that through the library networks, but also through other public networks operated by local governments, state governments, even commercial networks and shopping centres and so forth have been a really key way where people have maintained connectivity, free connectivity. And so that has been a real safety net. And of course, in this particular crisis, those things have been unavailable. And I think that's really challenging. I mean, I know that, again, there's probably a lot of people in the chat function discussing some options here for what's been rolled out in the past. I know a few years ago, New York Public Libraries started loaning out mobile broadband devices as an alternative to loaning books. And that was a way to get the internet into the home of those who need it. So there are some other creative solutions that we might see, and we maybe perhaps need a little bit of thinking around, protecting ourselves against this sort of situation in the future. Not that this one's over yet; it may actually cycle around more than once. So some of these solutions might be more immediate than longer term. But that notion of a sort of mobile broadband devices that could be provided to others is one that I think is perhaps useful in this context.
So a question regarding the organisational digital inequality. Claire Harris asked, can you please give some examples of the types of technology you were referring to? She assumes things like CRMs and other operational software, such as education platforms, digital marketing, but can you explain a bit more about that?
Yeah, so with smaller not-for-profits, we're talking about things as basic as the hardware often, but then Giving Australia did also show a very distinct, I'm speaking as an observer in the focus groups, a very distinct divide in use of various software, so CRMs in particular, for fundraising. A very huge distinct difference between the larger not-for-profits, including public hospital foundations, etc., and the smaller guys. It was actually, because I'm not a fundraising specialist, I found it quite alarming to see how different and how distinctly sophisticated the larger organisations were around this sort of stuff. But I don't want to underplay the role of digital ability, and I think someone who put up some material from the Connecting Up and Info Exchange survey data over many years has also pointed that out, that digital ability is a fairly significant issue. I don't want to make generalisations about the whole of the not-for-profit sector. You know, the sector employs 10% of Australians, and many hundreds of thousands of volunteers are involved. So I don't want to make generalisations, but as a whole, organisationally, if we compare them to other sectors, there's a lower level of digital ability among people who work in not-for-profits, and that can be challenging.
So we're getting very close to running out of time. Just a couple more questions. One, I'll wrap two questions into one. Beck Powell asks, how do we work to include and make sustainable technology-based intercultural engagement across all communities to ensure all can access and are appropriately reached? And Pallavi says, are there any particular insights around refugee communities and digital inclusion?
So if I had the answer to the first question, I wouldn't be here. I'd be off. Job done, off to grow vegetables. But in terms of if we're talking about ethnocultural diversity as distinct from other forms of cultural diversity, then it's actually an interesting scenario. It's very difficult to talk about people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds because, you know, you're talking about such diverse group of people. And with regard to people who are refugees, for example, it may depend on their background and their educational and professional experience prior to having refugee status. That's a big influencer. One of the things that we do know from past research and research that I was involved in 20 years ago is that students at post compulsory education levels, students from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds are often very technologically adept and experience inclusion more easily online than they might in face-to-face situations where their spoken English isn't as strong. So there's, and then the other thing is we know that diasporic communities, so people who've moved to Australia from another part of the world, will often have quite strong digital abilities because they're using online technologies in order to maintain connections with their home communities and their homelands. So it's a really diverse group of people. It's not really a group, and that means that the kinds of connectivity and experiences are very different. But I guess one of the key things in that is we need to genuinely practice inclusion and reduce active discrimination, which we also see quite a lot of online.
I might just point people to last year's index report as well, in which we did some work in Shepparton with newly arrived migrants, and the key takeout there was basically the need for higher levels of access, given those challenges of communicating with home, and also engaging in opportunities for immersion in Australian society. And the real challenge around affordability and ensuring affordability in those communities, affordable access, really important. The other message in that research was around language, around the idea of communicating in language and literacy issues. And I think that's one that sort of around accessibility, around making sure that we think about how to deliver material, not only in written, but also in oral translation forms as well.
Now, I know we're at time, but there is one more question, and so I'll squeeze this one in. Ian CHP says, hi, a skill that will become an expected skill of case managers will be assessing clients' IT infrastructure and skills, and then developing a case planning response. Do you know if there's any practice guidance on this?
So my quick answer is no, I don't, but I guarantee you there's at least one person still in this chat who knows. So someone's going to start pounding that keyboard any second and give you the answer, Ian. I'm conscious that Nick's going to close us off, but I just want to really acknowledge, I wasn't expecting to see so many people here, and I just wanted to acknowledge the very strong community of practice that has been immediately produced through this webinar with a huge amount of input. I mean, it's one of the things I say when I'm teaching in graduate programs is, I'm just one player, and the wealth of experience and knowledge that is in any room that I'm in is usually powerful. I'm pretty blown away by how much intelligence, not smartness, but material we have here, and I really thank everyone for your generosity in sharing it with each other.
Thanks, Jo, and I think that's a wrap. We will be sharing this, as I said at the beginning, with everybody once we've tidied up the video, and we'll be getting the slides out to everybody who participated as well. And you know where to reach us. You've got our contact details, so any questions, get in touch. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Nick.
Thanks.